And when you start to take responsibility for other people's stuff because you have this distorted belief that you're holier than thou and that you have this kind of inflated sense of control of other people's reality, then that's where it gets into being very delusional. You become a martyr. And so my shadow was very much what I'm describing now. And hello. So I did tell myself that when I started this, that I would like to be consistent about it. It's like when you go back to the gym and then you tell yourself, I'm going to start working out and I'm going to do so straight for a week, but then you skip the second day because you're so sore. And I'm not sore, but I did have some self-consciousness or some self-doubt, some doubt about the why. And I think maybe a lot of you who put things out there, who create things, or you get trapped in that questioning of why am I doing this? And then you're like, I don't know. Why do we do anything? And where I was. And then I had other questions like, what am I even going to talk about? And then I remember this exercise that is really very helpful in this book called The Artist's Way. And even though that is not a verbal exercise, I could still say that this in some way is similar to that. What they have you do is you write 3 pages in the morning and called morning pages. And you just write whatever comes to mind. It's like a mind dump. And in that way, you can not only get your thoughts down and you can let out all the blocking beliefs, but you could also see how, not all blocking beliefs, but there's all this censoring around our own inner voice. And that's the wall that I was talking about in the first video, where I just feel like there's this wall between me and sometimes even myself. And that's what I want to talk about today. You might have heard it before, the shadow work. This concept of shadow work is very popular in spiritual communities, and you could also say it's very mainstream in the psychodynamic world of the unconscious and the subconscious. So if I look different right now to you, because it is a different day and I'm having a different hair day, but I just realized when I was editing this video that I forgot to share what is a shadow. What is the shadow? And I assumed that everybody knew what the shadow was. But basically, the understanding of a shadow is that it is the part of us that we suppress or repress. It is part of our personality. It's what we deem as negative. And it's not we who created the shadow. It is what other people have. It's our family of origin, our culture, our society that we grow up in, and what they deem as inappropriate. But when we split our personality, and everyone does growing up to some extent because we are born whole in this world, that we start to have fragments of us. And so when it falls into the shadow, it kind of just like falls into the realm of our subconscious, which is the part that we don't even recognize, and that we hide from other people and from ourselves. And so it doesn't really go away. It just finds opportunity. It finds opportunities to manifest. Our shadow can be the catalyst for our personal growth, to become whole again, to start to integrate the parts of us that we've disowned, because it doesn't just go away when we try to suppress it or shun it or try to hide from it, because there's always going to be something that comes up in life that is going to challenge us to be fully present. A question that kind of stood out to me was this question about what qualities in others do I dislike or judge harshly? And I was like, ouch, that was right on. I think that's the feeling you get when you ask yourself any of these questions in shadow work, because all of these questions are very triggering. And let me just dive into the deep end and try to answer some of those questions in reflecting on myself as a therapist, as a client, and just as another person kind of reflecting on my own identity, actually did my thesis on is self-awareness and how that's really important as a therapist. I think you can't really be a therapist, I don't think, unless you have a level of self-awareness. I would say maybe empathy, obviously, through different experiences. We are constantly seeking growth, and each experience can teach us that if we're able to lean into it with intention, with a conscious effort. Although a lot of the times that I came to understand the inner workings of my shadow, it wasn't always when I went to therapy myself or when I was journaling. Sometimes it came from mistakes I made or unfortunate events or heartbreak. The shadow question that I wanted to explore, and when do I feel the most triggered or upset by others? And without giving any wild detail about any client stuff, I will say that something that I realized was that I was very much drawn to clients who, of course, felt familiar to me. Familiar as in I was projecting this feeling of spiritual closeness. I don't necessarily think of myself as a spiritual person, but I definitely gravitate towards meditation and mindfulness and yoga and all of those types of things. But I actually grew up Christian and a very strict Christian. And so I think I was always very drawn to this kind of these like socially conscious moral practices about elevating the sense of goodness. And so something I started to realize working with certain clients was that there was a lot of things that I just started to dislike about clients who were on this kind of spiritual path that I felt like I was on. And I realized that over time, it was because of, I don't want to say it was ingenuine per se. I don't even think that in periods of times when I myself were ingenuine or spiritually bypassing, which is essentially what the trigger has been for me, I don't think people are conscious of it. I mean, defense mechanisms, they are ego disowning. I just had to check this. So they don't go along with the way that one views themselves. And so when I had a client who was very spiritual or even religious, that they would use those practices as a way to bypass negative emotions and also disown parts of themselves that was bad. And that's something that I didn't realize that I do in a way, virtue signaling, meaning that you create this facade of I'm good. These are the things that I do. These are the virtues I have, even if it's not something that you practice. And so I started seeing the hypocrisy in myself and in these clients that kind of made me question what did I consider good and bad. There was a period of time where I felt like my spiritual side died. And at the time, I didn't really know what was happening to me. When I was growing up in a religious household, there's like this feeling of being guilt and shame ridden that you move further away from your humanity because it's conflated by this sense of being so morally good that when you fall even just a little, like you make a mistake, all of it comes crumbling down. And during the periods of times where I felt like I was falling from grace, I couldn't handle it. And when you're, as a therapist, you're still a human being and you see somebody going through something and you're like, yeah, you can't help but hold a mirror to yourself and be like, oh, I'm similar in that way. And so it really did start to frustrate me when I saw clients who were spiritually bypassing the process of getting into the inner work, into the hard work of being self-conscious, of feeling guilt, of feeling angry, of feeling things that we just don't want to feel or believe about ourselves. Okay. But I do want to add that it's not always about just appearing good, that some people and myself were drawn to these more spiritual practices. A lot of the times it was to escape deep pain because there is a sense of peace that any human being can get when they are in such despair and they need to believe that there's a power greater than them. And there is a lot of studies that show that this kind of faith and this kind of belief creates a sense of healing. It does help people foster a sense of resiliency through hardship. And that's a beautiful thing. But when we try to disown parts of us that we don't think are helpful or are negative, like the emotion of anger, when we say, this anger is bad and therefore I should never be angry at somebody who hurts me, then you're just going to allow somebody to hurt you. You're going to allow pain to continue. You're going to allow the suffering to continue because you're not willing to experience an emotion which now you've labeled as bad. And that's just one example of it. And I know that's something I've definitely struggled with because a lot of us are taught that anger is a bad emotion and in some moral sense, not a very good emotion to feel towards other people. But when we really think about it, emotions really are just, it's information telling us that somebody's crossing our boundary, that something is unfair, that there needs to be movement, that something needs to be done. And so I think a lot of the times when people are using the defense mechanism of spiritual bypassing, what they tend to do is they develop a sense of learned helplessness. And it's just cloaked in flowery language. Like, I don't know, like, I really like the saying, this too shall pass. I love that. But when you start to see that up close, when you start to see people living in their make-believe world of like, just like very disconnected from what is happening to them because they've succumbed to their circumstance, it's really sad. And so that is something that does trigger me, and not just as a therapist, but as a person. And it helped me realize when I was spiritually bypassing, because like I said, I had to learn how to be in touch with certain emotions. I had to learn that certain parts of my protector self, or parts of me that I shunned away, were not bad, and that they were actually there to help me grow as a person. And so I think when we try to label things as good or bad, we're actually disowning some of our greatest resources. And a lot of where I would see this kind of spiritual bypassing were people who deluded themselves into being in relationships that were very unhealthy. And they would come from a place of love, right? I love this person so much and I care about them. Why are they hurting me? And then the spiritual bypassing answer would be, you just got to love them more, right? You got to love them into healing. And that lack of logic and that very black and white thinking is what sets people up from being separated from reality. I used to think that similarly to some of these people who stay in relationships that are very toxic and abusive because of this kind of distorted belief, is I used to think that when you love somebody, you have to hold on to them. And I used to think that was love. I used to think it was keeping someone, right? But what I realized is that a lot of the times that's what creates the dynamics of being, in a way, a martyr, right? Like having this rescue fantasy of, I am a good person and I care about this person, and what, like that there's this transactional element to it, like, oh, but I can't expect anything from them because I'm a good person. But in reality, like, you're imposing on their free will. If you love somebody who is an addict, for example, right? There's some unconscious contract there, right? You know what you're signing up for. You know that this person is going through their own journey, however you want to call it. They're going through their own, and it's really hard to recognize that they have their own free will, and imposing on that free will is not just going to cause you pain, but it's also going to cause them pain, which doesn't sit right? Because of the love that you feel for them, you start to create these expectations that that's enough. That's gonna heal them, or that's gonna elevate them. But in reality, it just keeps you feeling stuck, and it keeps them, they will always feel bad in that way, because you're setting this expectation around what is their responsibility. And when you start to take responsibility for other people's stuff because you have this distorted belief that you're holier than thou and that you have this kind of inflated sense of control of other people's reality, then that's where it gets into being very delusional. You become a martyr. And So my shadow was very much what I'm describing now. And it was something that I had to really walk backwards with. I really had to look at where those fantasies came from. I had to really look at the distorted beliefs I had. And if you're ever in a space of feeling so much suffering from somebody else's stuff and you're taking on their stuff, you got to ask yourself, is this really about them or is this really about me? Do I have a fear of being alone? Am I reenacting something? What are the beliefs that I have that are not based on the reality? What am I not accepting? You have to ask yourself these questions. You have to be really honest with yourself and dismantle your own thinking around reality. And I think part of the work that I try to do now with clients is like getting them to really self-reflect. And I don't even just mean the parts, yes, I believe in the strengths. We definitely use that as a guiding force. We want to look at the parts that are not so pretty, the parts, our shadows, that are unwanted aspects of ourselves, the part of us that is wounded, the traumatic responses, the triggers that are located over here, right? And even though those are the triggering points, meaning those are the negative reactions we have, those are the defenses that come up, that's where we want to lean into if we want to grow at all. We have to get comfortable with leaning into the things about us that we don't like. And I think spiritual bypassing is one way that we protect ourselves from the bad. And so my long answer short, for me, the shadow work that I had to do was around spiritual bypassing. And so it is a really big trigger of mine when I notice other people do that, because it's something that I had to really work on. This virtue signaling, this holier than thou, this martyr. And I'm coming very clean about that because I hope that it helps somebody else to realize that it doesn't make you a bad person. Like, I know for myself why I struggled with that. I can work backwards and see where my attachment to my own parents created and shaped that. But it doesn't mean I have to reenact that over and over. And when I had found myself reenacting that or get triggered by that, I have to ask myself, why? Like, where am I living unconsciously? And so I think it is important to do shadow work, to look at your patterns, and also, maybe I should make another part to this, is to let your stories die. And I think that's a whole nother video, because we're talking right now about shadow work, and maybe in my next video we can explore a bigger, more general topic, which is this narrative identity, this continuity of self, but then dismantling that and being like, yeah, but I am not all these things. Like, we are these stories that we tell ourselves, but we're also not, right? Like, that two of those things can exist, that we are everything and nothing. But yes, I'm rambling now. I appreciate your time. I hope it was helpful. I'm going to link a shadow workbook, a workbook that I highly recommend, and I'll put some of the questions in the descriptions that I asked today. If you liked what you heard, stay tuned for more informational videos, vlogging, and subscribe. Have a good night.